Osama bin Laden, May 1, 2011. Aaron Ramsey scored the winner for Arsenal against Manchester United in the 87th minute. A deflected strike off his shin, his first goal in over a year, returning from a double leg fracture that had nearly ended his career 2 seasons earlier. The next day, U.S. Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden inside a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, ending a manhunt that had run since September 11, 2001. The CIA had tracked the compound for nearly 9 months after identifying it through a trusted courier's movements. The raid itself lasted under 40 minutes. President Obama announced it live after 10 p.m. Eastern. Crowds gathered outside the White House within the hour, chanting into the early morning. The compound was demolished by Pakistani authorities within a year, the land left empty. Bin Laden's body was buried at sea before sunrise the following day, following Islamic tradition, aboard the USS Carl Vinson, fewer than 36 hours after Ramsey's goal went in. The decision to bury at sea was made within hours to prevent the site from becoming a shrine. Steve Jobs, October 2, 2011. Ramsey scored in the North London Derby against Tottenham, a low strike from outside the box in a game Arsenal won 2-1. 3 days later, Steve Jobs died of complications from pancreatic cancer at his home in Palo Alto. He was 56. He'd resigned as Apple's CEO 6 weeks earlier, citing his health after 8 years fighting the disease and a liver transplant in 2009. He co-founded Apple in his parents' garage in 1976, was forced out of the company in 1985, and returned 12 years later to lead its recovery. Apple's stock dipped on the news, then climbed past its pre-announcement price within a week. Bin Laden, then Jobs. 2 goals. 2 of the most consequential deaths of the decade. Muammar Gaddafi, October 19, 2011. Ramsey scored a stoppage-time winner against Marseille in the Champions League, sending Arsenal through to the next round on the final kick of the group stage. The next day, Libyan rebel forces captured Muammar Gaddafi near his hometown of Sirte, dragging him from a drainage pipe after a NATO airstrike hit his convoy. He was killed within hours, ending 42 years in power, one of the longest reigns of any head of state in modern history. His body was put on public display in a meat locker in Misrata for 4 days before burial at an undisclosed location in the desert. 3 goals, 3 deaths, a terrorist, a tech founder, and a dictator, all gone within 72 hours of the same midfielder's foot. Gaddafi had seized power at 27, making him one of the youngest heads of state in history at the time of his 1969 coup. By the time Gaddafi's death made headlines, fans online had already given the pattern a name, the Aaron Ramsey curse. A Taiwanese animation studio produced a cartoon depicting Ramsey as a Reaper figure, which spread across social media within days of Gaddafi's death. Whitney Houston, February 10, 2012. Ramsey scored against Sunderland in a 1-1 draw at the Emirates. The next day, Whitney Houston was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, hours before she was set to attend a pre-Grammy party 1 floor below her room. She was 48. The coroner ruled the cause accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. The Grammys went ahead the following night, opening with a tribute instead of a performance. Houston had sold more than 200 million records worldwide and held the record for most consecutive #1 singles by any artist. 4 goals, 4 deaths. Houston's funeral in Newark was broadcast live and watched by an estimated 100 million people worldwide. She had been recording music since the age of 15 and had her first #1 single at 19. Paul Walker, November 30, 2013. Ramsey scored twice against Cardiff City in a 2-0 win, part of his most prolific season for the club, 10 goals before Christmas. That same afternoon, Paul Walker died in a single-car crash in Santa Clarita, California, less than 2 miles from a charity event he'd just left, hosted by his own foundation, Reach Out Worldwide. He was a passenger in a Porsche driven by a friend at high speed. The car struck a light pole and burst into flames. Walker was 40, mid-production on the 7th Fast and Furious film. The studio finished it using a combination of his brothers as stand-ins, archived footage, and CGI, releasing the film a year later than scheduled. 5 goals, 5 deaths. Walker's funeral drew a procession of more than 300 motorcycles and vintage cars through his hometown of Valencia, California. The 7th film, Furious 7, became the fastest in the franchise's history to reach $1 billion at the box office. Robin Williams, August 10, 2014. Ramsey scored and assisted in Arsenal's Community Shield win over Manchester City at Wembley, a 3-0 result to open the season. The next day, Robin Williams was found dead at his home in Paradise Cay, California, ruled a suicide. He was 63. He had been privately diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, a diagnosis his family didn't make public until months later when his widow described the symptoms he'd been quietly fighting in his final year. Williams had won an Academy Award, 2 Emmys, and 6 Golden Globes across a 4-decade career that began with stand-up in San Francisco clubs in the early 1970s. 6 goals, 6 deaths. David Bowie, January 9, 2016. Ramsey scored in Arsenal's FA Cup win over Sunderland, a routine 3-1 result on a Saturday afternoon. The next day, David Bowie died of liver cancer at his home in New York, 2 days after releasing his final album, Black Star, on his 69th birthday. He'd kept the 18-month illness almost entirely private, known only to his closest family and the small team who made the record. His death was announced by his son on social media. Bowie himself left no public statement. A week before his death, he'd been on a FaceTime call with his producer Tony Visconti discussing follow-up album ideas and demoing new songs. He didn't know how little time he had left. He'd released 27 studio albums across 50 years and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1996. 7 goals, 7 deaths. Tributes were projected onto buildings in his hometown of Brixton within 24 hours of the announcement. Alan Rickman, January 13, 2016. 4 days after Bowie, Ramsey scored and assisted again against Liverpool in a 3-3 draw. The next day, Alan Rickman died of pancreatic cancer at 69, a diagnosis he'd kept just as private as Bowie's, disclosed only to close friends and collaborators. He had completed work on his final film, Eye in the Sky, only months before. He'd made his film debut at 42, playing Hans Gruber in Die Hard, and spent the subsequent 30 years splitting his career between the Royal Shakespeare Company and Hollywood. 8 goals, 8 deaths. 2 major British cultural figures dead within a week of each other, each death trailing a goal by a single day. By now, betting sites were quietly tracking the pattern themselves, and one bookmaker briefly offered odds on which celebrity would die next. Stephen Hawking, March 8, 2018. Ramsey scored against AC Milan in the Europa League, his first appearance, back from injury. 6 days later, Stephen Hawking died at his home in Cambridge at 76, having outlived his original ALS prognosis by more than 5 decades. Doctors had given him 2 years to live back in 1963. He'd spent over 30 years as a professor at Cambridge and authored A Brief History of Time, which sold more than 10 million copies and spent 237 weeks on the Sunday Times bestseller list. He continued publishing research papers until the year of his death. His ashes were later interred at Westminster Abbey between the graves of Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. Comedian Ken Dodd had died 2 days earlier in that same window after the same goal, a second name nobody had predicted, hiding behind the first. Dodd was 90, had been knighted the previous year in the 2017 New Year honors, and had performed live until December 2017, 3 months before his death. The two men had never met and had nothing in common besides the date. 9 goals, 10 deaths, counting Dodd. Burt Reynolds, September 6, 2018. Ramsey scored for Wales in a Nations League match. The same day, Burt Reynolds died of a heart attack in Jupiter, Florida, at 82. Hollywood's biggest box office draw of the 1970s, topping the annual list 5 years running. He'd been scheduled to start filming a role in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood weeks later. The part went to Bruce Dern. Reynolds had starred in more than 100 films across a 6-decade career and was inducted into the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1978. He'd turned down the role of James Bond after Sean Connery left the franchise, a decision he spent years calling his biggest professional regret. 10 goals, 11 deaths, 9 years, 3 clubs, every category of fame a person can have, and Ramsey, when reporters asked him directly, called it a coincidence every single time.